In a previous video, I shared the same thing I'm going to share now again. However, if you didn't watch the other one and I put the roof on the building, it would collapse. So I'm going to start over again, and I'm going to bring you down the lines of what the Holy Grail really was. The beginning of Matthew is a pedigree that goes from King David, from King Solomon, to his firstborn son Rehoboam, and it goes king to king to king. One thread of royalty, all the way down until Judah, the kingdom of Judah, gets carried to the Babylonian captivity. Now they don't get to be kings anymore, but the birthright continues. 2 generations after the kingdom of Israel was carried into the Babylonian captivity, the heir to that bloodline's name was Zerubbabel. Well, Zerubbabel was commissioned by the king of Babylon to take his people back to the land of Judea, of where Judea had been, and set up a province. Well, it wasn't technically a kingdom again because Zerubbabel didn't get to be the king. He was the heir, and that's the reason why he was commissioned by the king of Babylon to become the governor, and why the people followed him. Now, Zerubbabel, there's a principle in royalty. In a royal bloodline, does a prince get to choose who he marries, or do the parents pick his wife? Because if the prince doesn't marry a woman with pedigree, the offspring doesn't get the birthright. This goes all the way back to Abraham. Abraham's son Isaac got the birthright over Ishmael because Sarah was Abraham's half-sister, and she had the pedigree all the way back to the Adamic dynasty. So we go from Zerubbabel to his firstborn son, who would have been the next rightful king, and his son, who would have been the next rightful king. I call it the begatitudes. And he begat, and he begat, and it ends up with a fellow by the name of Joseph, who has an arranged marriage to Mary, who at that time would have been the lawful king and queen of Judah and the scattered tribes of Israel at that time, if Rome had not been occupying Judea. That's why unto you a king is born. But we're talking about man's law and God's law. According to man's law, in Luke 1:32, I think it is, it says the kingdom or the throne of David would be given to Jesus. Well, that's a man's decree. So it comes from King David all the way down through Joseph. And the reason Joseph and Mary fled into Egypt was to protect the royal bloodline. So here we have Joseph showing up at this registration in Bethlehem with a woman who hasn't been stoned and a baby. Is he going to stand there and try to say, hey, look, that's really not my kid. That kid's God's. They'd have carried him away in a straitjacket. You don't cast your pearls before swine, people who don't understand what you're talking about. Now let's go to the wedding feast of Cana. Here we have Mother Mary at this massive wedding feast telling servants what to do. Do you tell somebody else's servants what to do, or do you tell your own? This demonstrates that this was not some poor pauper bloodline where Joseph and Mary were a couple of paupers that couldn't afford a room. There was no room at the inn. And if your wife was going to be giving birth, you sure wouldn't want them around a bunch of humans. It'd be far more I'm sorry, I'm having a brain freeze. It'd be a whole lot better with a lot less people around if you were in a stable. So anyway, here we have Jesus being born in the appearance the King of Israel. And the fact that Joseph didn't try to spill the beans in front of the Romans, the actual Roman records just would have shown that Jesus was the heir to the throne of David. Now, if you're able to receive this, you realize this premise that sometimes it's taught out there that Joseph was already married before and had children. Well, if he had children before, other sons would have gotten the birthright over Jesus. So that demonstrates he was not an old man, and there's a lot of errors in the traditions that were being sold from the pulpits. So now let's take it a step further. Rome recognizes Jesus as a king. Remember when Pilate said, "Are you a king?" And Jesus says, "You say that I am." And what this is literally saying is your record and your laws show that I'm a king, and you are only a governor. This case, legally, under Roman law, could only be heard before Caesar. So, according to the law of the land and the throne of David being given to Jesus, it was actually recognized by Rome, Pontius Pilate, etc., that Jesus would have been the king. And this is the reason why his clothes were worth so much, and the real reason why they were making mockery of him with the crown. They were sending a message to the Judeans. This is the guy who you thought was going to deliver you out of bondage, the heir to the bloodline who was born under a new star, and he's not delivering you. This is Mother Rome, and don't you ever raise your finger to Mother Rome. Look what we're doing to the king you thought was going to deliver you. Now we're going to step further. If Rome recognized Jesus as a king and not just a prince, Joseph would have had to have been deceased. Now, in those days, were women free, or were they the property of men? Who gives this woman to this man in holy matrimony, at which time the name changed along with custody? It wasn't much different than what it is in the Islamic system today. The women were the property of men. So, under the parameters of the day, if Joseph had been deceased, and he would have had to have been deceased for Jesus to be recognized as a king, upon his death, who would have inherited custody of Mother Mary? And that should answer the question that has been asked for ages. Why would Jesus call his mother woman instead of mother? Isn't that disrespectful? Not if he had custody, which he would have had, of the Dowager Queen. Now, if it was the responsibility of Joseph and Mary's parents to betroth, I should say for Joseph's parents to provide a wife with pedigree for him as the heir of the royal Davidic line, might that not same thing apply to Joseph and Mary, being responsible to provide a wife with pedigree for the heir? And at what age would this have occurred? One of the books that's been taken out of modern scripture that's still in over half of the world's canon, half of the Christian world's canon, still has 80 books, and one of those books is called the Book of Tobit. In the Book of Tobit, the archangel tells this young fellow that before you consummate your marriage, you'll spend 3 days in prayer, which goes along with that as fasting, before you consummate your marriage. So the question is, if Jesus in fact did marry, might he not have practiced such a tradition, and I want to say commandment? And would the wedding feast be held before or after the 3 days of fast? And we're going to go to the wedding feast of Cana. And on the third day, Jesus goes to a wedding feast that's being presided over by his queen mother, where she's telling the servants what to do, this massive wedding feast. If she's the queen mother, it would have been a royal wedding. And if you look up the other definitions of the word was called, was recognized. It says both were recognized. Jesus and somebody else were recognized at this wedding feast. So I'm going to let you ask yourself, matter of fact, pray on it. Whose wedding would that have been? Now, here's where the trap's been set. Many people would say, well, oh my gosh, he was married. Now, who was his wife? Let's back this up. For a woman to have had the right to look upon a man, let alone touch him in his naked condition, what relationship would she lawfully, morally have had to have been? Well, if a man died, wouldn't that body have to extensively been seen and handled naked to prepare for burial? If you had a woman going to a tomb carrying spices intending to prepare a deceased man's body for burial, what relationship would she have had to have been? Bingo. Now here's the trap. What the adversary has done is said, okay, now you recognize that this was Christ's wife, and here is the family. And the adversary slides in a fraudulent bloodline that goes all the way back to Cain. It's called the Merovingian bloodline. But here's the mystery they've all overlooked. As a crown prince, Jesus would have been required to have married a woman with pedigree by the age of manhood. Got any idea what those 3 days of the temple was all about at age 12? Jesus would have been a grandfather by the time of the crucifixion. And some of you are going to be jumping out of your skins. We'll go back to Isaiah 53:10, I think is where it is. He says he would see his seed. That means his offspring. Now, for a woman to have had the right to prepare a man's body for burial, what relationship would she have had to have been? How many women went to the tomb that morning? Some are going to say, oh my gosh, one was his mother. Actually, it doesn't say it was his mother. 3 women went. And one of them had 2 sons by the name of James, the Less, and Josie. A woman would be known by the most famous man in her family, not her children. So, and there was another woman who happened to have a son who'd asked the question, which of my sons is going to sit on your right-hand side? That's the position of the crown prince. Now, before you totally lose your mind, who's the only lawful person Jesus could have passed custody of his queen mother onto just before he died? Woman, behold thy son. John, behold thy mother. And she went and lived with him henceforth. You got any idea now why John was his favorite and why John was at the foot of the cross? He was there to give moral support to his dad. Now get your own answer on that, and don't believe a thing I've told you. You've got to get your own answers. May you be blessed in so doing.